Lord, we just thank you for this evening, Lord, for bringing us out in not so nice weather to join with one another and join with you, Lord, as we worship and explore your word. Lord, I just ask now that you would speak to us through your word. Pray that we would be able to yield our spirits to yours. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So you can open up to 2 Samuel 18. We're moving towards the end. Seems like this particular saga that we're in with David is just, well, it literally has gone on for weeks. We're still not going to completely finish it tonight, but we'll come to a little bit of a conclusion to what he's been going through. And remember that last week we just saw that David was in exile with many of his men, and we closed that chapter seeing 3 different individuals bring them a lot of supplies in the way of food and things that they needed. Let's just pick up verse 1. It says, "And David numbered the people who were with him, and set captains of thousands and captains of hundreds over them. Then David sent out 1/3 of the people under the hand of Joab, 1/3 under the hand of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the hand of Ittai, the Gittite. And the king said to the people, I also will surely go out with you myself. But the people answered, You shall not go out. For if we flee away, they will not care about us, nor if half of us die will they care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us now, for you are now more help to us in the city. Then the king said to them, Whatever seems best to you, I will do. So the king stood beside the gate, and all the people went out by hundreds and by thousands. Now the king had commanded Joab, Abishai, Ittai, saying, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains orders concerning Absalom." So we see David divide the full company of his men into 3 different areas under 3 different generals. And we see that David wanted to participate. He wanted to go out and fight with his people, but the people persuaded him that right now the most important thing he could do is remain in the city, remain behind, because his death would have there would have been no purpose in fighting if David went out and was actually killed. So the soldiers march out of the city, and then David gives public orders. It says here that everybody heard the orders that he gave, and that was that they were to deal gently with his son Absalom. And really here at least I know I'm just surprised one more time that David as a father just does not see the pattern of mistakes that he has continuously made with his son. He's never brought discipline against this one. So much so that when he ends up having to leave his own city and his own throne, he wants these men who are going out to fight against his son and their forces to be kind to him. Which, in the sense of warfare, in the sense of what this son has done against his father, it's just an absurd order. But I think something that's interesting and very telling here is that it says, deal gently with him for my sake. And I think any of us as parents know that when we give discipline to a child, eventually that may be for our sake, because we want that child to continue to be disciplined and learn their lesson. But it really is for the sake of the child that we discipline. When we hold back discipline on a child, it's normally for our own sake, because we don't want to seem mean in their eyes. We don't want them to look at us, poorly because we discipline them. And David really here is continuously taking care of his own needs. He's done all this for his own sake. Because if he had done it for the sake of his son, he would have disciplined like a loving father would have done. And I think that's kind of interesting in the times that we live, because you see modern parenting, and modern parenting tends to be letting things slide, not really bringing discipline against a child, Whereas I just so love to see when a parent stands in the middle of the store and begins to count. 1, they never make it to 2 or 3. Doesn't work. And so David's counting. 1, and the son's not listening. Verse 6. So the people went out into the field of battle against Israel, and the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. The people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David, and a great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day. For the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Then Absalom met the servants of David. Absalom rode on a mule. The mule went under the thick boughs of a great terebinth tree, and his head caught in the terebinth. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, and the mule which was under him went on. So we see here this battle is fought in the woods of Ephraim, which is east of the Jordan. And there were 20,000 fatalities that day amongst Absalom's troops. And it was largely, it tells us, the result of the dense forest in which these soldiers were trapped. And there's many dangers in a forest, uneven ground, pits, and they don't mention it here, but I'm going to guess maybe wild animals were included in part of this defeat. But David's army is victorious, and then we get this picture of Absalom, the son of David, fleeing from the forest, and he's caught by his head in a huge terebinth tree. And then the mule goes on without him. He's literally hanging there. And there's sort of like a poetic justice here, and the thing that he was most prideful of, his hair on his head, ends up being the thing that really gets him caught in this situation and eventually leads to his downfall. Because remember, he was told he had like 6 pounds of hair that he would cut off every year. He won't have to cut it off anymore. Verse 10, now a certain man saw it and told Joab and said, I just saw Absalom hanging in a terebinth tree. So Joab said to the man who told him, you just saw him? And why did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have given you 10 shekels of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, though I were to receive 1,000 shekels of silver in my hand, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, beware lest anyone touch the young man Absalom. Otherwise I would have dealt falsely against my own life. For there is nothing hidden from the king, and you yourself would have set yourself against me. Then Joab said, I cannot linger with you. And he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through Absalom's heart while he was still alive in the midst of the terebinth tree. And 10 young men who bore Joab's armor surrounded Absalom and struck and killed him. So this messenger comes to Joab and reports on Absalom's helpless position. And he gets rebuked by Joab for not doing anything about it. But if he logically explains, if I had killed him, then I would have had to deal with the king. I heard the king's order. And if I had to deal with the king, you would not have been there to back me up. And so Joab decides to take care of it himself, and he kills Absalom, really him and his armor bearers, because it seems like he thrust through 3 different spears, but then the armor bearers came behind him and finished the job. And of course, this was against the king's command, but I think Joab knew rightly that it was the best thing for the kingdom. And I guess he was willing to deal with whatever flack that he caught from the king later. And again, we see that David consistently refused to punish his sons for their crimes, and eventually that kind of thinking and that kind of behavior is going to bring the discipline that's needed to somebody else's door. And that's really what happened here with Joab. Verse 16. So Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab held back the people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a large pit in the woods, and laid a very large heap of stones over him. Then all Israel fled, everyone to his tent. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up a pillar for himself, which is in the king's valley. For he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and to this day it is called Absalom's monument. So here we see that as soon as the deed's done, Absalom's dead, Joab wisely calls off all the fighting because the major objective that they had, which was Absalom himself, had now been accomplished. And then they throw Absalom's body into a pit, basically an unmarked grave, and they cover him with stones. And that grave really was in stark contrast to this monument that we find out Absalom built to himself. It says that he had no heirs, but we find out in his story that he had 3 young sons. And so we can only assume, and it is an assumption, that they perished young. And so he had no heir, so he builds a monument to himself as his legacy. Pick up in 19. Then Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, "Let me run now and take the news to the king, how the Lord has avenged him of his enemies." And Joab said to him, "You shall not take the news this day, for you shall take the news another day. But today you shall take no news, because the king's son is dead." Then Joab said to the Cushite, "Go tell the king what you have seen." So the Cushite bowed himself to Joab and ran. And Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said again to Joab, "But whatever happens, please let me also run after the Cushite." So Joab said, "Why will you run, my son, since you have no news ready?" "But whatever happens," he said, "let me run." So he said to him, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. So this man, Ahimaaz, wanted to carry this news to David. So Joab doesn't want him to, and we find out in the story this man here had a reputation for being the bearer of good news. And so it would have been out of character for him to bring the news of Absalom's death. So Joab sends this Cushite as the official messenger, but after he leaves, this other man argues his point and gets to run after and actually passes him up as he goes. Verse 24. Now David was sitting between the 2 gates, and the watchman went up on the roof over the gate to the wall, lifted his eyes and looked, and there was a man running alone. Then the watchman cried out and told the king, and the king said, "If he is alone, there is news in his mouth." And he came rapidly and drew near. Then the watchman saw another man running, and the watchman called to the gatekeeper and said, "There is another man running alone." And the king said, "He also brings news." So the watchman said, "I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok." And the king said, "He is a good man and comes with good news." I'm impressed with this watchman that he can watch a guy run from that far away and somehow knows who he is. Verse 28. So Ahimaaz called out and said to the king, "All is well." Then he bowed down with his face to the earth before the king and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." The king said, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant and me, your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I did not know what it was about." And the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. So in this whole thing, we have David he's on the lookout. He's at the gate. He's waiting to get news of what has taken place. And then the watchman reports one runner and then another runner. David hears the first is this man who always brings good news. So he's preparing himself for good news. But then drawing near, Ahimaaz ceremoniously announced that the Lord had struck the rebel army. But when David asks about his son, he kind of gives this generic, vague answer, but there was this great tumult, but I don't know what happened. So it seems this man has a difficult time bringing bad news. So pick up in 31. Just then the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "There is good news, my lord the king, for the Lord has avenged you this day of all those who rose against you." And the king said to the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" So the Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you to do harm be like that young man." Then the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said thus, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. O Absalom, my son, my son." So now we have this Cushite arrives after finishing his run. He announced that David's enemies have been defeated. And notice, in both cases of the messengers, that the message they brought that the Lord had won the battle. Didn't give credit to Joab, didn't give credit to the men. These men recognized that they'd been handed this victory because of the Lord. But then the inevitable question from the king about Absalom brings this blunt reply that all of David's enemies should be like that young man. In other words, dead. So this news plunges David into a very deep mourning. And what really tends, I see it, and as kind of a pathetic mourning takes place. He throws himself, in this very kind of odd way, saying, I wish I had died instead. And he's lamenting this son. Of course, it is his son. But when you think of all that's happened, it just seems out of place that this would be his reaction. But it tends to be seen in this story as one of the greatest griefs of David's life. And it's doubtful that he ever forgave Joab for what he did, because he had ordered not to be done. Let's pick up in the first verse of 19. And Joab was told, behold, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. So the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. For the people heard it and said that day, the king is grieved for his son. And the people stole back into the city that day as people who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. But the king covered his face, and the king cried out with a loud voice, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" Then Joab came into the house to the king and said, "Today you have disgraced all your servants who today have saved your life, the lives of your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives and the lives of your concubines, in that you love your enemies and hate your friends. For you have declared today that you regard neither princes nor servants. For today I perceive that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died today, then it would have pleased you well. Now therefore arise, go out and speak comfort to your servants. For I swear by the Lord, if you do not go out, not one will stay with you this night. And that will be the worse for you than all the evil that has befallen you from your youth until now." Ooh. Quite the backlash from a servant of the king. But we might, in our own modern language, say it like this: somebody had to do it. Somebody had to tell him the truth. And he really did. He brought this shame amongst his people as if they had done something wrong, when they had done exactly what the king had ordered them to do, besides the killing of Absalom. But that was David's mistake to not include that in his orders. In verse 8, then the king arose and sat in the gate, and they told all the people, saying, "There is the king sitting in the gate." So all the people came before the king, for every one of Israel had fled to his tent. And this is what the people needed to see. David sitting as king in the place of authority. That's what the gate was in a city, was the place of authority. And this told them that their sacrifice was worth it, that it was appreciated, and that David would continue to reign. And Joab's rebuke worked because Joab cared enough to say it, and David was wise enough to hear it. Verse 9. Now all the people were in a dispute throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "The king saved us from the hand of our enemies. He delivered us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he has fled from the land because of Absalom. But Absalom, whom we anointed over us, has died in battle. Now therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing back the king?" So David survives Absalom's attempted overthrow, but the kingdom was not yet restored to David because he needed the people to be behind him. And the tribes of Israel understood what David did for them. They understood that they rejected him and embraced Absalom. And they understood that Absalom was now dead. So it left the people of Israel in dispute about bringing back the king. Let's pick up in verse 11. So King David sent to Zadok and Abiathar the priests, saying, "Speak to the elders of Judah, saying, why are you the last to bring the king back to his house, since the words of all Israel have come to the king, to his very house? You are my brethren, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then are you the last to bring back the king? And say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? God do so to me, and more also if you were not commander of the army before me continually in place of Joab. So he swayed the hearts of all men of Judah, just as the heart of one man, so that they sent this word to the king: "Return, you and all your servants." Then the king returned and came to Jordan, and Judah came to Gilgal to go and to meet the king, to escort the king across the Jordan. So when David heard that the 10 tribes of Israel were talking about restoring him to the throne, he sent 2 priests to the elders of Judah. Remember, it's a split kingdom. He asked why his blood relatives were the last to bring him back as king. Judah had supported Absalom heavily in the rebellion, and doubtless some had resentment and fear. David decided to remove Joab as commander-in-chief, probably because he had killed Absalom, and to appoint Amasa to take his place. Now Amasa, who was a nephew of David, had just recently been the general of Absalom's army. So to outsiders, it must have looked like David's punished loyalty and rewarded a rebellion, a government policy unlikely to produce political stability. But these moves won the hearts of all men of Judah over to David's side, and they sent a unanimous welcome home message to him. And so now we've got David back on the throne, Absalom's out of the way. And I'm surprised how fast that went. That's why I decided to rest tonight, because it kind of changes channels again going forward. So I guess you guys get a bonus early night. Thoughts or questions about that? Or anything? Rick?